After a series of surprising roster moves made on Monday, where do things stand with the Panthers defense less than a week away from roster cutdown day? I'll talk about it right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, where typically on Wednesdays, I answer your weekly Wednesday mailbag questions. The important thing is I need weekly Wednesday mailbag questions to answer. So I'm going to push the mailbag to tomorrow on Thursday. I just need you to at me or DM me, but of course, follow me on Twitter at Julian Council and give me questions so I can answer your question. Next week, no mailbag. There are more important things to talk about, like the Panthers' initial 53-man roster and some of the moves they're going to make after that. So last chance to ask me a question before the end of the preseason, before the roster is down to 53 men, and then we'll do one right before week one. So get those questions into me, at me, DM me, Julian Council over on Twitter. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So yesterday, we looked at the Panthers' offense, took inventory of where things stood a week away from roster cutdown day, 4 p.m. Tuesday, August 27th. The Panthers and the rest of the NFL had to be down from 90 men to 53 men, the initial 53-man roster, as the roster will be ever evolving. Looking here in Carolina, with the amount of injuries, the amount of depth concerns that this team has, and also having the number one waiver wire priority, those roster spots that are going to be claimed there on Tuesday may not be claimed by certain players by Wednesday at that same time. So they're going to be very busy. I like they have been very busy throughout training camp and the preseason, bringing in players mainly at the back of the roster. Do not expect that to change for Dan Morgan, Dave Canales, Brant Tillis, and this organization once we get to roster cutdown day next week and head into week one and Labor Day weekend. So want to talk about the defense today after looking at the offense yesterday, and really want to focus in to begin the show on the cornerback spot, as there was a surprising move made on Monday afternoon, right as I was recording the show, where Lamar Jackson, who was slated to be the number 3 corner, had really earned that spot, is no longer here in Carolina. He was waived, injured on Monday. He was not put on IR, which is important to understand, where they put another player, Anthony Brown, on IR. If you go on IR and you're there once the season begins, your season is over. So Dave Canales also was asked about Lamar Jackson on Tuesday when speaking to the media. He didn't want to get into the timelines of how long he's out. It feels like to me that right now Lamar Jackson's a player who is injured, can't perform in the preseason, probably can't help them early on, week 1 or week 2, but they didn't want to end the season. They want to potentially bring him back. I'm just guessing based off of the waived injured designation and also how he has performed so far through the preseason, where he had a 79.1 PFF grade defensively in his first 2 games and a 90.0 coverage grade, which is elite coverage grade from Lamar Jackson in those first 2 preseason games against Patriots and the Jets. But right now, he's not a Carolina Panther. Does not mean that down the road he cannot be a Panther again sometime this season, but that certainly was surprising based off of how he's played. But also, we did know he had an injury, turned out to be a knee injury, and it's a little bit more significant right now to where the Panthers don't want to keep him on the roster. You can ask me, well, Julian, if they potentially want to bring him back, and if he was their 3rd corner, why get rid of him right now and not keep him on the 53? I thought Mike Kay, the Charlotte Observer, friend of the show, made a really good point on Twitter on Monday when he was addressing that very question from Panther fans, talking about how Lamar Jackson is still someone who's battling for that roster spot. It's not set in stone. We know that J.C. Horn, that Troy Hill, that Dane Jackson, and that Cha Smith-Wade, the 5th-round pick out of Washington State, are going to be in this cornerback room for various reasons. Contract, seniority, talent, being just drafted, the politics of the league. We knew those four. And if you think about the numbers at safety, the Panthers probably only had one guy remaining that they were going to keep at that cornerback spot. And if that guy currently is injured, and there's other two like Sean Jameson, DiCaprio Boodle, who've also looked good at times during training camp and preseason, why save that spot for someone who currently cannot help you when it's one of the last roster spots left over here in Carolina, with about less than a week now away from getting down to 53 men? So a good point that Mike brought up, and I think a point that I also agree with. You can bring him back down the road, and that was never going to preclude the Panthers from potentially cutting Lamar Jackson the next day once they got their waiver claims in and potentially brought in a player at that exact spot. So looking at the rest of where the cornerback room sits right now, J.C. Horn, and you look at all the injuries, it's positive that he is healthy. He is someone who has missed 29 of a possible 51 games in his first 3 seasons in the NFL here in Carolina, and he must stay healthy throughout this training camp. The Panthers have really monitored his snaps. They have not had him out there playing a ton. I saw him against the Jets. He was not really out there at all. Lamar Jackson, Sean Jameson, DiCaprio Boodle, they were getting opportunities during that joint practice last Thursday while J.C. Horn was being held out from those team periods. He has not played in the preseason. I do not expect him to play in the preseason, even though Dave Canales said on Tuesday when asked about that he's open to Panthers starters playing in the preseason, even though the Bills starters are not going to play in that preseason finale on Saturday afternoon. J.C. Horn is healthy. He looks good. And the hope is to get him through all 17 games this season and justify the Panthers placing their faith in him and exercising that fifth-year option for 2025. Troy Hill also has not played in the preseason, but also has looked good throughout training camp, especially early on in those practices that I was able to see there on Mint Street, or I guess on Cedar Street rather, in Uptown Charlotte. He was really good. Like, he's going to be fine. Dane Jackson, unfortunately, he's dealing with a significant hamstring injury, something that Dave Canales said a week ago was going to take him 6 weeks. And if you look at it, that puts him right around potentially being ready week 4 against Cincinnati. But I think, just being realistic, likely not going to be ready until the beginning of October. So he's going to be out for the first 4 games of the season. And that's where you won Lamar Jackson, who had been the third corner, had earned that spot to be able to step up into that role. But I don't know if the Panthers ever planned on Lamar Jackson going into week 1 being the starting corner opposite of J.C. Horn. I always felt once Dane Jackson was injured that they were going to absolutely be interested in bringing someone either off the street or via the waiver wire once roster cutdowns happen next Tuesday. And speaking of someone off the street, we saw on Sunday that former Carolina Panthers, Stephon Gilmore, is not returning to Carolina. He's actually going to the Minnesota Vikings, signing a 1-year contract worth up to $10 million with $7 million guaranteed. Gilmore will be 34 years old next month. And I saw plenty of Panther fans were not happy about the Panthers missing out, and I'll put that in quotes, missing out on Stephon Gilmore. And when you look at that number, much like last season, Gilmore made sense for Carolina. And I think Carolina could have made sense for Gilmore, depending on what he was looking for. Minnesota, hard to look at them as necessarily being a contender when Sam Darnold's their quarterback, but maybe with Justin Jefferson and Kevin O'Connell calling plays, that things will work out for them. I think Aaron Jones is now there in Minnesota as well. They're in a better spot to contend this year than the Panthers are. So maybe it makes more sense for him from a competition standpoint. And I think financially as well. I don't think the Panthers were going to give Stephon Gilmore $7 million guaranteed and up to $10 million as well. Look at last year with Yannick Ngakoue, who had spent time in Indianapolis with Frank Reich. There was an obvious need at outside linebacker. He would have made sense here. You look at the deal he signed in Chicago, were the Panthers going to give him that kind of money? I don't think so. You look at also Leonard Floyd, made a lot of sense, knew the scheme, had ties with Jero Avero. He signs in Buffalo for a decent amount of money that I'm not sure the Panthers are willing to spend. And you can question, why would the Panthers be pinchers or whatever and not want to give these guys who can help their team some kind of money? I totally understand that. And looking at the situation in Minnesota, I was reading Adam Schefter, and he was saying that Shaquille Griffin, Byron Murphy Jr., their plans, Minnesota's plans were to go into training camp with Shaquille Griffin, who was here last year, and Byron Murphy Jr. Then had a group of young corners, and it's Caleb Evans, Mekhi Blackmore, Andrew Booth Jr., and then their rookie 4th-round pick, Kyrie Jackson. As we know, Kyrie Jackson passed away in a car crash, unfortunately, this summer. Blackman tore his ACL on the first day of training camp. Griffin's currently dealing with a hamstring injury, which was suffering the second day of training camp up there in Minnesota. And then they traded Booth to the Cowboys. So that was a team that is desperately in need of Stephon Gilmore's services because of a tragic death, some injuries, and their decision to move off of one of those players and send him to Dallas. Carolina, they're sitting here right now. JC still available. Like, yes, Dane Jackson, that just recently happened with his injury, Troy Hill, and there's some young guys that they were giving an opportunity to. I don't believe that Stephon Gilmore is someone who's going to change the trajectory of the Carolina Panthers season. I still feel like this is a team that's headed to the top 5, top 10 of the draft next season. I totally understand that he's playing a position of need and that he's been here. He's familiar with Dan Morgan as they are neighbors down there in Waxhaw, and that Jadeveon Clowney, his boy from South Carolina, is here and has advocated for him to come here, but also understood that the money's got to be right for Stephon. And the money was not right, it appears, here in Carolina from all that I know. I don't think that's a deal that they were going to do. And I look at it this year, the Panthers really should be focused on developing some of these younger players more so than spending $10 million potentially on a guy who's 34 and who's not going to be here next year and in the future. DiCaprio, Bootle, Deshaun Jameson before he was injured, Lamar Jackson, those are guys who potentially can help them down the road, that they can be solid quality depth pieces in that cornerback room. And possibly, who knows, they develop to the point where they could be starters. Stephon Gilmore was not going to be that past this season in Carolina, and I don't think that they necessarily missed out on him. It's unfortunate that they weren't able to make it happen. And when you look at the situation now where Jackson is no longer on the team for now, I'll add, and also that Dane Jackson is injured, both the Jacksons aren't around, you see a pretty obvious need at that corner spot. I think the Panthers are going to be very active when it comes to placing those waiver claims next week, and they're going to get 1, maybe 2 corners. And when we saw the press release come out on the Monday night when they waived injured Lamar Jackson, they also signed Chris Wilcox and Quandre Mosley. Do I think either one of those guys have a chance making the team? I don't think so right now. Maybe they go out and play well on Saturday against Buffalo, against those 2s, those 3s, and they prove themselves. Think it's a little bit too late for that to be the case, but it's a possibility, certainly. I think Carolina is going to be looking at the waiver wire and trying to bring in someone who can be either a proven starter in the past or someone who can hold down the fort until Dane Jackson gets back healthy, and possibly they bring back Lamar Jackson down the road. Not the best spot to be in. And this was a concern heading into training camp. And after the first week or 2, I was feeling pretty good about what I saw from Lamar Jackson, what I saw from DiCaprio Bootle. But now Jackson's not here. Dane Jackson's injured. The Panthers didn't pony up the money for Stephon Gilmore. And we're right back wondering, if this team loses J.C. Horn, what are they going to do on the outside at corner? And that certainly is something to be concerned about, less than a week away from the initial 53-man roster being put together. But it's going to look different by the time they get to week 1 down in New Orleans. I can promise you that. All right, let's take a quick pause. Then we'll come back. We'll look at the defensive line and the outside linebacker spot and see how they shake up heading into roster cutdown day next week here in Carolina. We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. You've heard me talk about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you today. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel any time. And what a deal this is. I know plenty of you who watch and listen to the show don't live here in the Carolinas are not getting every Panthers game, whether you live in California, you live in Texas, anywhere else around the country. It's a $5 bet. And in 3 weeks, you get the Saints game, you get the Chargers game, you get the Raiders game, no problem. And also, YouTube TV is great. I've had it for almost a decade now. I love it. Unlimited recording. Sign up for this. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Let's take a look at where things stand with the Panthers defensive line and outside linebacker group less than a week away, actually, from roster cutdown day here in Carolina. Get down from 90 to 53 men, and then we'll still see plenty of changes made over the course of the following days, heading into Labor Day weekend and then heading into week 1 as the Panthers head down to New Orleans to face off against the Saints. And starting off, looking at the defensive line, Derek Brown, Shai Tuttle, A'Shawn Robinson, we have not seen them in the preseason, and I don't expect that we'll see them on Saturday. I know that Dave Canales has come out and said that he's open to the idea. It all really depends on health. And looking offensively, last week, they had, obviously, the joint practice with the Jets, but also there were concerns with Robert Hunt and him having a scary injury, which turned out to not be as scary as they thought. Chuba Hubbard also getting banged up there, and Damian Lewis trying to work his way back. Chandler Zavala had a hamstring, which turned out, that we found out now, was not as severe as they thought that was going to be. So there were some concerns there, offensive line-wise, with the injuries, and they didn't want to put Bryce Young out there at risk and have kind of a mismatch unit. I totally understand that. Defensive line-wise, they've, knock on wood, they've been healthy. Derek Brown, Shai Tuttle, A'Shawn Robinson, the starting 3, they've all been solid throughout training camp so far. And then looking behind them, TJ Smith has been one of the surprises of training camp in the preseason when looking at that defensive line unit. He has, I feel like, really solidified his spot on the roster as that 4th guy behind Brown, Tuttle, and Robinson. And he had a 72.3 grade this past Saturday night against the Jets. So far through 2 preseason games, he has 3 pressures and 2 sacks. He has been a solid force there in the middle, a former player from University of Arkansas in his 3rd year in the NFL. He's got to be on the roster, I think, after the way he's played. Nick Thurman, I would think he would be safe after what we saw from him a year ago, and he's going to be kind of competing for that final spot, it seems like, with LeBron Ray, who I've not seen out there over the last couple of weeks, was not in the preseason game against New England, did not play on Saturday, did not see him out at practice either. I was asking around to figure out what the deal is, and it appears to be an illness, and you have to question what illness could he potentially have that has him missing this much time during training camp in the preseason. You draw your own conclusions, I suppose. So Nick Thurman, I would think he's going to be right there in the cut line. Ray, not sure how they feel about that right now. He could be somebody signed to the practice squad if he does not make the initial 53, and they could also try to bring him back later on if they need to. Jaden Crowdy, the 6th-round pick out of Mississippi State, does not look like he's going to make it. He suffered an ankle injury against New England, was not able to practice or play last week. Not sure whether he was out there on Tuesday for practice or not. And even before that, I had been told that it was going to be a long shot for him anyways. And based off of already having Brown, Tuttle, and Robinson solidly as your top 3, the way TJ Smith has performed in camp and in the preseason, having somebody like Nick Thurman and even Ray, who were able to play last year for this exact same coaching staff, same defensive line coach, and Todd Wash, I don't think it's going to happen for Crumpety. Hope is, though, they can sign him to the practice squad and continue to develop him, even though at like 23, 24, he's already an older developmental player anyways. They already have somebody like that in DJ Johnson. And speaking of DJ Johnson, looking at the outside linebacker group, it's clear they're saving Jadeveon Clowney for the regular season. He was talking to Carla Gebhardt on the Panthers preseason broadcast on Saturday night. She was asking, how many of your family members are out there tonight? He said about 4 or 5. There'll be 20 or so once we get here to week 2 when we face off the Chargers. That's when I'll be out on the field. He knows that he's not playing on Saturday, and he was not even that much of a participant after the first 11v11 session last week in that joint practice with the Jets. They are trying to preserve him, and they have to when there's no idea when DJ Wonnum's coming back. In the same case for Amari Barno, and I don't know what the expectations for Barno would have been anyways, heading into his third season. Clowney's pretty much the only known commodity as far as a guy who we know can be productive at that outside linebacker spot on this roster, with Wonnum currently injured, still recovering from the quad, and maybe there's something else that may be ailing him as well. And Barno with the ACL, it's going to take some time, but he's certainly not a proven commodity at that spot. Special teams wise, certainly, but not as a every down or even situational pass rusher at that outside linebacker spot. K'Lavon Chaisson, he also has not been a participant in the preseason, as feels like they're trying to save him as well. Those two guys, Clowney and Chaisson, are vets, and you're getting Clowney, and there is certainly hope that they can get more out of Chaisson than what he gave the Jacksonville Jaguars in the beginning of his career, now here in Carolina. And DJ Johnson, he's gotten plenty of opportunities to show what he can do so far this preseason. He's played 50 snaps, and his overall PFF grade has not been all that impressive. It's only one piece of the puzzle, but you watch the games, it's not like he's having that big of an impact. He has a 58.5 PFF grade right now, 2 total pressures, 1 in each game, 3 tackles. It's not like he's a disruptor. His tackling grade actually was pretty damn good. It was up there in the 80s. So you like that. He's not missing tackles. And first and foremost, Jero Rivera wants these guys at outside linebacker to set the edge, and Johnson has helped set the edge. He's just not getting that kind of pressure that a lot of fans would like to see, and that I think this team is going to need to see from him, as, again, we don't know when Wonnum or Barno are going to be back, but mainly DJ Wonnum, who's coming here to play a role. And I do wonder, he's got a 2-year deal. Do they keep him around for next season if he's not going to participate that much this season? And we don't know. I hate to say I don't know so many times, but right now there just is a lot of unknown there when it comes to his health and when he's going to be ready to go. And the Panthers have played things safe with a lot of these guys. But they also have not had much of an update at all when it comes to Wonnum and even Josh Nijman and Barno, those guys sitting there on the PUP list. Eku Leota, he was outstanding against New England, had a 90.1 defensive grade, was not as good against the Jets, fell all the way down to a 40.1 grade against New York, but he has 6 total pressures, 3 times as many as DJ Johnson, but he's missed 3 tackles. And that's one of the things that it's not going to be great. That's not allowed. You can't be a back of the roster kind of edge rusher and someone who needs to be able to set the edge and stop the run and have 3 missed tackles in the preseason. That hurts his case. It's great he gets pressure. Love the way he plays. You got to be better and wrap it up there. And then Luigi Villain is someone last week when we were speaking to Ejiro Rivera following practice on that Monday morning, he brought up how well he played in that preseason game and how well he's performing throughout training camp. And looking at his overall grade so far through 2 preseason games, he's got a 77.7 grade and 7 pressures, which is the most among any Carolina Panthers outside linebacker in the preseason so far. And there's opportunity. Clowney, Chaisson, Johnson, those 3 clearly going to be on the roster. Leota, Villain, it seems a lot like corner, where I think they're going to be pretty aggressive trying to find somebody via the waiver wire. May not be aggressive in trying to give somebody $10 million. I think the Panthers are going to be looking the same way, trying to find someone. And this also depends on what they know about Wonnum and what his availability is going to be beginning of the season and just this season period. That will influence their decision on what kind of claim they make and if they want to go potentially spend money on someone like Yannick Ngakoue, who still is out there, and I'm guessing is looking for the kind of money he was looking for a year ago, whether that's realistic or not. We'll take one more quick pause and come back, look at the linebackers and the safeties and how things stand with those 2 position groups 1 week out, or I suppose a less than a week out from roster cutdown day here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Football season is almost here, and the best way to get to games this fall is with Gametime. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Gametime Picks curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concert, comedy, theater, etc. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying concert tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Before we get out of here, let's take a look at the Panthers linebacker and safety rooms here heading into the final week of the preseason and looking ahead to what the initial 53-man roster may look like. And I'll give you all a heads up. I believe, next Tuesday, which will be the same day we find out. It will really come out on Monday, likely. I'll probably put this episode out on Monday. I'll give y'all my final 53-man roster projection as far as my final initial 53-man roster projection. That'll come out on Monday. And so stay tuned for that. But yeah, looking at it right now with linebacker, I like most of the starters. Shaq Thompson, Josie Jewell have been held out this preseason and still don't expect them to play, even though, as I mentioned a couple times now here on the show today, Dave Canales said that he is open to that idea, despite the fact that the Bills will not have their starters out on the field in the preseason finale in Buffalo on Saturday afternoon. Shaq Thompson, he was dealing with a hamstring early on in camp. He came back last week, seems to be healthy. That is good news, as he is going to be important for this team. They were not good against the run last season. You go back to 2022, look at his PFF run defense grade. It was in the 90s, an elite grade. To have Clowney here now, Derek Brown back, bringing in Ashawn Robinson, Josie Jewell next to him, I think this can be a pretty solid run defense compared to what it was last year, which was one of the worst run defenses in the league. 31st according to EPA. That's expected points added. That should not be the case if Shaq Thompson can stay healthy, if Josie Jewell can stay healthy, and the rest of those additions that they made and Derek Brown play their part. And even more, obviously, expecting more out of Derek Brown again this season there and the defensive interior on this defense, Carolina. Trevin Wallace and Clyde Sherlin, those guys have really looked good so far in the preseason, especially Charles. 87.4 grade through 2 preseason games, had 6 tackles versus the Jets on Saturday. Trevin Wallace has a 66.3 grade. He had 5 tackles against New York in that game on Saturday night. And those guys were all over the place, it felt like, and really good to see. I know last year I felt good about the linebacker depth, having Kamu Grugier-Hill here and having Deion Jones as well, who initially didn't make the roster, but then did come back later on that season and had to play a lot of games because of the injury to Shaq Thompson. We had 2 proven veteran linebackers who were backups last season. Now you have 2 guys who aren't proven as far as Charles has been a special teams guy, and that's why the Panthers brought him on last year. And then Wallace, as you know, was a 3rd-round rookie out of Kentucky. And to have those guys playing as well as they played so far in the preseason in the absence of Thompson and Jewell as they're being held out until week 1, that is encouraging to see. As I felt like heading into training camp, the Panthers had about a trio of linebackers that were more special teams players, like Charles, like Tay Davis, like Michael Barrett, and I guess 4 of them, as you had Chandler Wooten in there as well. I did not know whether they had any of those guys who could step up and truly play the position potentially at this level. And granted, it's the preseason. Clyde Charles has played that role really well through the first 2 weeks of the preseason, and we'll see him again out there on Saturday alongside Trevin Wallace, who is going to get an opportunity this season, even behind Shaq and Josie, to play a decent amount of snaps in preparation of potentially replacing Shaq Thompson in 2025. Michael Barrett, surprisingly, was actually the highest graded player on the Panthers defense on Saturday night against the Jets, an 81.6 grade. He is known to be a special teams kind of ace, and I had conversation with people, and they were telling me that likely he was not going to make the roster because of just guys like Tay Davis ahead of him. He had guys like Cam Gill ahead of him who are also linebackers who are special teams kind of aces. Clyde Charles, who's around and who's going to make the roster now. It was going to be difficult with the injuries to Gill and to Davis. Quite possibly Michael Barrett is in a better spot today than he was a couple weeks ago when I was told that information. And he helps himself out when he has a strong preseason performance like he did. And Canales is somebody who I think really takes into account what happens in those preseason games, how these guys play, and whether he can trust them moving forward. So Tay Davis's foot injury opens the door for Michael Barrett, also opens the door for Chandler Wooten, who's been here the last couple seasons as a special teams ace at that inside linebacker positions. That's how things stand less than a week away from roster cutdown day with the inside linebacker position. Looking at safety, and I keep talking about how safety is like the most underrated spot here on this roster, and I keep talking about safety last. But you look at the other storylines, corner, plenty of concern with the depth there. I was surprised that Lamar Jackson's not on the roster right now. They did not get Stephon Gilmore. Felt like that was more pressing. Outside linebacker, that's still a pretty big concern, not knowing when Woonham and Barno is going to be back and what they're really going to get out of Clowney and Chase on this season. Safety, it's the deepest position group on the roster. Right now, there is a concern about Xavier Woods, who is out a couple of weeks. I was said last week by Dave that he has a groin injury. Not sure whether he'll be ready to go week 1, but he said it's going to be a couple of weeks. He could not give any timelines. And when he was asked about timelines on Tuesday, he was saying how he's not really trying to do that right now as they're getting a lot closer to week 1. So they're trying to keep things a little bit closer to the vest, more so than they were earlier on, which is just a week ago. So we'll see what the deal is there. And Sam Franklin Jr. broke his foot, but he'll be back at some point this season. He's a vital piece of the special teams here in Carolina, but it wasn't like he was going to be one of those top guys as a backup helping out at safety. Like Woods, Jordan Fuller, Nick Scott, those are the three who Ojero Vero pointed out last week. He sees them as a starting safety trio. So Fuller, Scott, they would be in position to start week 1 if Xavier Woods is not healthy. And behind them, Alex Cook started games last year, looked good. He was outstanding in that first preseason game against New England, had a 74.4 grade, but then was the lowest grade defensive player versus New York on Saturday. Not quite sure what happened there, as I was trying to tune in, but it was really hard to be focused and locked in on that game on Saturday night. Rudy Ford, who they just brought in, who started 15 games over the last 2 seasons in Green Bay. He played 24 snaps versus the Jets. These some of the Panthers could keep around. And Damani Richardson had an excellent week last week. 2 interceptions on that Monday, 1 off of Bryce, 1 off of Jake Plummer. And then the way, God, is it Jack Plummer? Now I'm confused. Now I'm confused about Plummer. Off of Plummer, we know who we're talking about. But he then had an interception in that preseason game on Saturday night. He seems like he's in a good spot. Jamie Robinson led the team with 7 tackles versus New York on Saturday. Like, there's an argument that there's 7 guys that could be rostered at the safety spot. You have Woods, Fuller, Scott, Cook, Ford, Richardson, then Robinson. Like, there's 7 guys. I think they're only going to keep 5 because I think they're going to keep 5 corners. I think they're going to keep 5 guys at safety. And it looks like 2 of them who are going to miss out. Like, Alex Cook may not be on this team. Rudy Ford, they just brought in, may not be on the team. Damani Richardson, who had a great week last week. Jamie Robinson, who they drafted last year. Like, 2 of those 4 aren't going to be here in Carolina once we get to 4 p.m. next Tuesday. And that just speaks to just how deep this roster group, this position group has been, and not has been, but is, and how talented they are. And it's good to see that they have that kind of talent at safety, that kind of depth, as there have been a lot of depth concerns across the rest of the roster here in Carolina. So that's where things stand with the safeties and where things stand with the defense. 6 days away from when we'll find out who the initial 53 men will be on the Carolina Panthers roster heading into the 2024 season. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe, follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Wednesdays, I'd like to answer your weekly Friday mailbag questions or weekly Wednesday mailbag questions. I keep messing that up. But I'm going to do it tomorrow on Thursday. Hopefully, just send me in questions right now. Get them in. I want to answer them. If not, then we'll just do it week 1, and hopefully that I'll get more questions then. But we'll see. In the meantime, though, be safe, be happy, be whole, as always, and forever keep pounding And I'll talk to you on Thursday, where I would like to answer your mailbag questions.